It's not a lack of transparency because they're open about it, but they should just not disguise it and just say, hey, program is free, but we'll just give you less money.
It's watertight over here, right? You cannot get away with poor governance over here.
All right, everybody. Hi, this is Tim. I'm here with Melvin Yuan. Melvin is a founder based in Singapore and Palo Alto. Melvin is the founder of Stellar. Melvin, nice to have you on the pod. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Melvin, you and I go back a few years. We were both iterative cohort number one. Back in that time, you were running a slightly different business called Starboard, right?
Yeah,
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? I'm curious to learn more.
sure. So it's pretty much the same business. From day one, we set out with a mission, and it's to make it super easy for founders to start and scale their company anywhere in the world. The reason why we changed the name from Starboard to Stellar, couple of reasons, and one of the key things is when we started off with Starboard, we approached it as a SaaS. We wanted to build a SaaS platform to help the people who were helping the founders to incorporate the companies and operate it and all that. Since then, a few things have happened. We started Starboard in Singapore and we focus on the corporate services firms here to help them. We later realized that what we really wanted to do is go straight and help the founders. And so the mission remained the same. The way we approach it changed a little bit. On top of that, we raised a seed round from a VC in Singapore, and as part of the whole, as part of our plans, we accelerated our plans to head to the US, and so we wanted to create a name that was distinct from where we were previously. And I guess especially in the last 1 year, generative AI has enabled us to really advance some of our initial goals. And one of the goals I had at the very beginning was I wanted a founder to just be able to walk in the room and say, "Hey, Stella, help me form 100% owned subsidiary in Vietnam," and it would get done, right? And because we want to build a platform that's optimized for voice, Stella just rolls off the tongue a lot easier. So many
Yeah,
reasons.
it sounds familiar, actually. And when you said it out loud, it almost sounds like, isn't it used by any of the big groups? I mean, obviously it's not Siri, but Stella sounds so familiar. It's weird. How did
Yeah.
you come up with that name?
Well, I was just basically sitting down doodling. I've got a lot of people who like the Starboard name because it sounds very formal and serious and very suitable for a company that's doing corporate entity management. But Starboard rolls off the tongue a little harder in some countries, and I've had in some cultures people like starboard, and it took a while. Stella almost sounds like a girl's name, Stella, right? So
Sounds like a beer too.
that yeah, Stella Artois, exactly.
Stella Artois, exactly. Like
Actually,
I
it
forget if it's
was
Belgian or French, but
it's Belgium, and I know it very well because my first job outside the army, I spent 6 years as an infantry officer, but right after that, my first civilian job was in public relations, and I actually was part of the team that brought Stella Artois and Hogarden to Singapore.
oh wow,
Right.
super cool. It's actually funny you mentioned you were in the army because the last guest I recorded with was also a veteran, 11 years in the military in Italy. So it's like
Oh wow.
back to back guests who are veterans. That's very interesting. And now the question is like, okay, he became a founder after joining the military, and he talked about how the like structure that he learned during those 11 years really helped him face adversity during the founding phase and also manage his stress. Now, what's your experience leveraging what you learned in the military to becoming a founder?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I've really. It's hard to really pinpoint. You know, it is the whole experience. It's stress. It's being able to distinguish strategy from tactics. Is understanding that a lot of times there's no right answer. We learn a lot about doctrine. We can learn a lot about doctrine. We can rehearse our drills, and those are super important. But when you're in on the battleground, right? When you're actually in action, a lot of these things, a lot of the old rules don't exactly apply, or a lot of the rules that you think should be rules don't exactly apply,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So when
Like,
you're under pressure, a lot of the structure you have in the back of your mind doesn't
yeah,
necessarily apply. Okay.
it's important. The drills are super important. They sort of train your muscle memory, and I find them useful. And so sometimes those
Mm-hmm.
principles are really useful. But I think it's not so much about what we learn in terms of our knowledge, but it's more like what we experience, just being comfortable with chaos. And I think that's
Okay.
what founders, pretty much learn. So I kind of think all founders go through pretty much the same training, just not, in the military.
Yeah, fair enough. And it might sound a bit cliche, but I come from a finance background, and one of the go-to books is The Art of War.
Mhm.
I applied some of the principles to my businesses in the past.
Yeah.
Have you read the book? Is that something that you applied as well, or not at all?
I read it a long time ago. I'm not too, I don't remember the exact principles, but every now and then, a principle would emerge, and I'm like, yeah, I think I read about that in Art of War. It's all
Cool.
meshed, right? I mean, I read
Yeah.
that, but we also learn military tactics, and so it's
So tell me a little bit about your career. So you went through the military, and now you're running this startup. How did you go from one to the other? Like, let's hear about the trajectory a little bit, if you don't mind.
sure. So, um, well, I did a communications diploma in Singapore. And when I was doing my diploma, I interned at a public relations firm. And the firm was run by an ex-army major. And I looked up to him, and I thought, wow, it's a great example of somebody from the military who made a successful transition into the private sector. And so that started becoming a consideration. And then after I graduated from Polytechnic with a diploma, for a whole bunch of reasons, I decided I would sign on in the army. I was in the middle of officer cadet school, and I thought this is getting interesting. I was really enjoying life in the army. I really enjoyed what I was doing, and I thought, well, I'll make it a career, right? Because Singaporean men have to serve about 2 years. Back then, it was like 2.5 years in military
Hmm.
service. And I thought, well, why take it as 2 years of national service and look at it as an obligation? Why not sign on and make it a real career? So I was interested in it. And because of the diploma I was doing, I could potentially accelerate my career in the army by completing a degree in a year and a half. And so I was offered a military scholarship, signed on, and that's how I got started. Couple of reasons, and not going to go into details right now, but a couple of reasons led me to eventually leave the army, and I left the army 5 years, 5.5 years after, and I went back to join the public relations firm that I interned at.
Oh, wow.
It was being in the army, you have a 6 months, notice period, and this firm waited for me for 6 months, and so I took up the job, went into public relations, and back then, Web 2.0 was starting to emerge as a thing. We talk about Web 3 right now. We've been talking about Web 3, but actually, Web 2 was when I first experienced the web, or rather, was obviously, on the internet, but Web 2 became a thing, and I started applying Web 2 technologies to the field of public relations and communications.
Hmm.
And because I was one of the few people in Singapore, and I think in the world, to do that at a point in time, I started getting interesting opportunities in communications and marketing agencies. I ended up helping a few large agencies to build their digital marketing teams. I was eventually hired into a global public relations firm to build up their digital strategies group for Asia. And so I did that for about close to 3 years. I joined as a sole consultant, ended up building a book of business, and built a multi-million-dollar business unit for the company. And when it came close to 3 years, I told myself, well, I think I want to build a company on my own. I experienced what it was like to build a business unit, and I thought I'll build a company on my own. Around the same time, one of my primary school classmates um, was married to a professor in wireless technology. And she connected us, and she said, "You seem to be doing something in digital marketing, digital advertising. Husband's professor in wireless communications. and you guys should do something. So we started a conversation, and back in the day, location-based services and location-based advertising was one of the more talked about things, right? We were beginning to understand the power of using location technology and location data for advertising and user engagement. And so, long story short, we formed the company, the two of us, focused on using location data. So my co-founder back then was able to use Wi-Fi signals to locate mobile phone indoors, unique mobile phones. And with that, we were able to provide shopping malls and hotels and hospitals with location data. And they could potentially use that to send very targeted messages to people in their premises, right? So you can imagine the use cases for shopping and hotels and whatnot. So we started a company, we called it YFind, the letter Y and FIND, YFind Technologies. We started that, I actually started that while I was on sabbatical. So tracing back a bit, I didn't leave my job immediately. The business unit that I built, I didn't leave it immediately. I loved the team, loved the company, and we were exploring having me posted to the US in HQ after everything that I did in Singapore and Asia. And so I said, I'll go on sabbatical, I'll figure some things out. I went on sabbatical, started building this company, and eventually resigned in the middle of my sabbatical. And one of the impetus for resigning is, after we started building, we entered a few pitch competitions, got a grant from the Singapore government to develop the technology, won a pitch competition, and a VC approached us. And this was like 2011, thereabouts, 2010, 2011, where in Singapore, we didn't really know much about how VC worked, how venture capital worked. And we're like, oh, this person, this company, this organization, this firm wants to give us like $1 million+ to build something. It got exciting really quickly, and so we accepted their investment. I quit my job. My co-founder and I did this full time, and we started building this company for a couple of years. So that was Wi-Fi. We eventually got acquired in the US. So we built it in Singapore, went to the US to knock on doors, eventually got acquired by Ruckus Wireless in 2013, 2014, thereabouts. So I worked with the company for a year. I think after a year, I left. I thought I'll take a sabbatical. I wanted to take a sabbatical, but on day one of my sabbatical at a beach resort, I spoke with an artist. Started getting very fascinated by the concept of unique commissioned art pieces, and so I started like on day one of my sabbatical, started working on a platform that eventually became the Commissioned, and it was a platform to essentially enable buyers and sellers, enable people to commission original works of art and to essentially sell derivatives and share the profits with the artists. We started in Singapore, found a co-founder, did this, wanted to get into an accelerator in Silicon Valley. And so went to Silicon Valley again, knocked on doors, eventually got into the program. It was an accelerator called NFX, and it stands for Network Effects. Got into the program, but on day 2 of the program, our mentors, the founders of NFX basically said, you should change your business idea. This is not a great business idea. We like you, we don't like the business model. And so my co-founder and I ended up pivoting for about a year, trying to find the right business model for us to work on, something that was exciting enough for us. Landed with a joint venture. We pivoted to essentially to work on a joint venture project with a financial services business in Singapore. They didn't form the joint venture after 5 months of work, very disappointing. And so that came to an end. We disbanded the team. Unfortunately, we really enjoyed working together. Unfortunately, had to disband the team, and we just went our separate ways. That's when I decided I'm going to take a real sabbatical. So I spent about 2 years plus in Melbourne on a sabbatical. Came back to Singapore after that, itching to start a business, but did some consultants, and then a few months after, started this company. So
wow, what a story, man! It's so Well, first of all, I recognize a lot of similarities between us, and I think that applies to a lot of founders. The difficulty of actually taking a sabbatical, it's all too familiar. That's number
Mm.
one. I'm actually in the exact same situation at the moment. You probably know we sold Tendo Pay last year,
Yeah.
just finishing the earn out right now. And in my mind, I was telling myself, I'm going to take a sabbatical. I'm going to stop. I'm going to chill. I'm going to take my time to figure out the next idea. And of course, the things just happen. People are knocking at your door asking if you might want to consult with them. And you're like, well, like, I don't mind helping people out and making money at the same time. I already have ideas for the next project. So all too well, I know the situation. So, but by the way, congrats on the acquisition. You know what? It's good that we're having this podcast because I didn't know this whole story, your background and all. Like, I know what I see on LinkedIn and what we discussed during the incubator, but we didn't get to know each other in person that well. So, very interesting to learn the whole story. It's super inspirational. Uh, Speaking of, what was your experience at Iterative? Because I know, like, the goal of this podcast is really to inspire existing or aspiring founders in Southeast Asia and across the world to work in Southeast Asia. And Iterative comes to mind as one of the key players for accelerating startup ideas in the region. So you went through it. I'd love to get your perspective on how it all went.
Gotcha. Wow. Well, we had a very unique experience of Iterative in that we're the first batch. So I bet, there was a whole bunch of experiments which they were running. And it was the COVID batch, right? So when I think your experience would have been the same as mine in the sense that when we spoke to the Iterative partners, we thought that we would have a full-on in-person accelerator experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I went through that experience in the US with NFX, and it was a great experience. And I thought it would be the same experience. Unfortunately, we were hit by COVID, so everything was on Zoom. So I must say that initially it felt like the experience was a little bit of a disappointment, right?
Mm-hmm.
No critique to what the iterative partners are doing, but just simply because of like everything. In fact, the whole world felt like a disappointment because we're just dealing with COVID, right? Massive. And so it wasn't, it was a trying time, I'd say. It was a trying time, and we were trying to get support from each other, from partners. We're trying to find support from the program as a whole, and it was challenging. But I must say, you could tell that the partners, Brian and Sukan, really gave their all. And they continued to be helpful and they continued to be really supportive all the way beyond the accelerator. So really grateful for those guys. And I'd say the iterative experience, it's so easy to jump into answering this question by thinking of the 3 months that we spent together on Zoom. But I'd say I'm most impacted by the iterative experience that started on day one of our program and all the way until now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. So another question I have is because as of the last month where I've really been active on this, well, on LinkedIn, on the podcast and all, I've spoken to probably like 30 different founders in Southeast Asia, just talking. And one of the other, like, there's a few other programs out there other than Iterative. You probably know Antler, etc. And
Yep.
every one of them has told me that these other programs are taking a fee to run through it. So they'll invest in you and
Yep.
take back part of that investment as a fee. I don't know
Yeah.
if you have thoughts on that. I was quite shocked, I have to say.
Well, I wonder if Sukan asked you to ask the question. I think it's quite, yeah. That's been a lot written about this, right? And so I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think I would appreciate it very much, but I think every organization has a right to do what they want. Would I go for it? I'd say if I don't know. I'm not sure. I personally wouldn't do it. I personally won't go for it. But I've also met founders who would never have gotten started if they hadn't gone through some of these programs.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Actually, like some of the people I've spoken to, their ideas are fantastic. And they didn't mind paying the program at all. So I guess like to each their own, as you said, right?
Yeah.
Whatever works.
What do you think?
And so, yeah, I'm exactly like you. I would probably not have taken the deal, but the thing is, we have different backgrounds. We've already got successful exits under our belts, and we don't necessarily need to go through that program. There's other alternatives. We do programs because of the benefits other than money. For example, the connections, the access to a demo day, things like that, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's a little painful to get some money and pay it back, but I totally understand the need for it. And for some people, if it's their only solution, then why not? You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, they should just look at it as they're getting a smaller funding than they're really getting. I think it's just it's not a lack of transparency because they're open about it, but they should just not disguise it and just say, hey, program is free, but we'll just give you less money. So then you kind of justify it a little better. I don't know.
It's really to essentially inflate the valuation in a sense.
Fair. That's exactly what it is. But anyways, let's move on from this sensitive topic. And Suken did not ask me on the record. He did not ask me to ask that. I met with Suken a few weeks ago, and we had a really good chat. But he did not ask me to talk about it.
Gotcha.
Okay,
yeah. At the start of our conversation, we talked about my military background, right?
Yeah.
And so on one hand, I can see how easy it is to say that it shouldn't be done this way. And I actually do agree with a lot of what Suken said, his point of view. I agree with that. And for me, because, when I got into Iterative, that was my second startup. I sold the first company. So I probably would have set a higher bar for myself, right, in terms of what I would accept for funding. But if you draw from the lessons of military and just being in total chaos, you just play whatever game, you do whatever it takes to survive, you do whatever it takes to beat the competition, you do whatever it takes to get ahead for yourself.
Yeah, agreed. 100% agreed. Let's move on from this topic, and I want to ask you about Singapore, because I've interviewed people all across Southeast Asia, and I believe you're the first founder from Singapore that I'm talking to. And, I look at Singapore as in like a super developed area within a more like up and coming region. So can you tell me some of the differences of like establishing a business in Singapore? Obviously, most Southeast Asian companies will eventually establish in Singapore or Hong Kong, but operating in Singapore, finding talent in Singapore, like what are some pros and cons versus the rest of Southeast Asia?
Pros and cons versus the rest of Southeast Asia. Wow. There's a ton of things to say about the subject. Obviously, I'm in the business of helping founders incorporate in Singapore, so obviously I'm going to have a lot of things to say about that, right? Governance is, it's watertight over here, right? You cannot get away with poor governance over here. I guess that's why all the VCs and basically all investors and family offices, they all invest over here because this is a great place to invest in well-governed companies. And so actually a lot of people in the region, in Southeast Asia, they incorporate Singapore entities, even though most of their business is done back home. But they do that for a couple of reasons. One, access to capital. And two, just having this semblance of credibility.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. So I understand the idea of incorporating them for sure. And that's why most startups in Southeast Asia will eventually incorporate there. It's easier to raise money, but you're operating in Singapore as well, right? So you're probably hiring staff in Singapore. Your clientele is in Singapore, partially at least. So do you have anything to add about that specifically?
Well, it's our customers are here. Our team members are all over the world. We have got team members in Silicon Valley. We have some team members in Melbourne and in Malaysia and KL. So they're spread all over. We built a company during COVID, so people were just remote by nature, and so we just hired from wherever. Customers are mainly here. It is a small market. It's a great market, but it's also very small. and it's hard to build a really, really large company in this small market. So
Right.
even though I'm operating here, my business is not Singapore only. We have customers from all around the region. We handle Singapore entities. We also handle US entities and Malaysian entities.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. And you're in this business, so you'll probably have a lot to talk about. But how easy is it to incorporate in Singapore as a founder who is not based in Singapore but operating a company in Southeast Asia?
Oh, the incorporation is it's super easy, as you know. But if you're not based here, the main thing is if you incorporate a company in Singapore, you need a local resident director. That's the one neck to choke if something goes wrong with your company, right? That's why that's why Singapore has got such great governance because if you're a foreign founder, you need a local founder as a director of your company. And sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a business partner, and sometimes it's somebody that you pay as a nominee or a local resident director.
Yeah, okay.
That
So
part,
nominee
finding that
directors
person,
are.
finding that person takes a bit of time, but otherwise everything else is fairly easy. And there are companies and platforms like ours that provide, essentially a local resident director as a service.
And nominee directors are totally fine in Singapore, because I know that the news just came out in Thailand that they were cracking down on nominee directors and they didn't like it, etc. But in Singapore, it's a totally like on the books strategy and practice, right?
Well, so it's a lot more nuanced in that you're basically hiring a local resident director, and you're essentially paying the local resident director to perform a set of duties as director for your company.
Okay.
But they are responsible as directors. So if a founder does something wrong, they are personally liable for the company for
Oh
whatever
wow.
wrong actions. Obviously, they have an agreement between the founder and they would have, first of all, they would have the rights as a director, so that way they can protect themselves, and they have an agreement with the founder what they would do or what they would not do for the company.
Okay. Fair enough. And just again to wrap up on Singapore, you're living there part of the year.
Mhm.
If you had to sell it as a place for someone to start a business in or to move to, because we're targeting some of the foreign founders as well who might want to move to Southeast Asia. If you had to sell Singapore, could you do it in like a few sentences?
Um, it's probably the best place to access capital, partners who would finance your business. You probably have access to a pretty talented population. I'd say it's getting super expensive. And so, therefore, I think a really good structure is form your business here, find great funders over here to fund your business, and use this as a base to build an operations that is regional.
Okay, but you wouldn't recommend for them to live there necessarily, especially if they're starting out and financially they're still up and coming. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's an expensive place. You could extend your runway a lot by living in a neighboring city like Kuala Lumpur, even Johor, and some people live in Bali and they start businesses from there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are great tips. Bangkok's always nice as well.
that's where you are,
Uh,
right?
that's where I am. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not selling it. I try to say neutral in my podcast, but yeah, Bangkok is where I am, and I love it.
Hmm.
And you've spent a long time in Southeast Asia, obviously. So I always try to ask my guests if they have some juicy stories of things that happened to them in Southeast Asia, because it's known to have some fun stories. I'm curious if you've had any wherever it is in Southeast Asia.
Hmm. Juicy stories is what kind of juicy stories?
Well, I can tell you one guest that I spoke to, and the episode's not out yet, so I'm not going to say who, but basically they had a story where they were hiking on the border of Myanmar and Thailand,
Yeah.
and their guide got sick all of a sudden and abandoned them, and they were lost in the jungle for 8 hours until they finally yelled enough that someone found them, and they thought they were going to like die there. That's pretty juicy. I wonder if you have
Okay.
anything that has happened to you that we could say only in Southeast Asia kind of thing.
Hmm. Um. I'm not sure. Maybe I spent so much time here. I'm kind of used to all of it.
You're
It's not
you're
not
numb
new.
to it.
But the moment you mentioned it, I think of this one time when I was in Vietnam. I was in Ho Chi Minh City, and I was there. I was backpacking. I felt ill. I was like running a high fever, and I was so sick I could barely get to the hospital. But I got there. I checked myself into the hospital, and like the nurses were drawing blood and everything. I don't remember very vividly what happened, but I remember just stirring from my semi-conscious state and looking at what the nurse was doing, and the nurse was drawing blood and messaging on the phone at the same time. I was like, oh my gosh. I'm not sure I feel very safe in this hospital.
Yeah.
Eventually recovered, obviously, and got home, but somehow that memory stuck in my mind for a long time.
Yeah, so it can go both ways, right? With the healthcare system in Southeast Asia. I've been
Yeah.
to a hospital in Bangkok where I'm like, what is this place? It's like a 5-star hotel. You would never get that in Canada or France. So I've been, really impressed. But yeah, you have other types of hospital, and I don't know how long ago it was, and things are evolving fairly fast. But thanks for the story. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm from here, so maybe you should ask me about stories of Silicon Valley.
Tell me some stories from the Silicon Valley. I'm curious.
Well,
Things that shocked you.
my wife. So we moved up. My wife and myself and our two children moved up a year and a half ago. About a year and a half to 2 years ago. We went there to basically figure out how do we build Stellar for the US. Anyway, we're living in Silicon Valley. We're living in Palo Alto, and it's a nice, safe space, right? And next to Palo Alto is Menlo Park. But one Sunday, my wife and we were all at Menlo Park in the morning for church, and I decided to head home to Palo Alto first to get some work done, as founders would on a Sunday. My wife and children were there, and they decided to have a picnic lunch and head back on their own. They were waiting then at the Menlo Park train station for a train back home because we were living next to the train station. And then my wife realized the train wasn't going to arrive anytime soon, so she turned around, brought my kids to take a grab back. So she walked 2 minutes away from the train station when she heard 7 gunshots behind her from where she was standing. Next thing she knew, all the people that were in the cafe next to her where she was walking past got up and ran, and they all ran into this building nearby. Somebody in this apartment building was kind enough to open the apartment building door, and 30, 40 of them all ran in there and tried to hide. And they hid in there for, I think, about an hour or so until the police came and made sure the area was clear and gave the all clear. And several hours later, they finally got home. But the 1 hour that they were in the building, my wife called me and said something. I don't remember the exact words, but she called and there was a bit of tremor in her voice. And she said, like, we're okay, but. And then she narrated what happened. And I was like, wow. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what to do. I wanted to go down because they were there. I wanted to go down to just extract them on my own, but my wife didn't want me to do that. So I was, on the phone, and I was like half ready to go down. We kept in touch the whole time on the phone, and eventually police came, gave the all clear, and she came back. But that happened in the heart of Silicon Valley, not Southeast Asia.
That is, you know what? That's encapsulates so much that I believe in, and that is just like the reality of life these days. And I don't want to get political, but
yeah,
you just described what I've been preaching to my friends and family for a long time, that when you look at Europe and you look at North America, without focusing on what's in the news, but the reality, Southeast Asia is way more developed than those places by far, in many aspects, and that's just that's an illustration of it.
Yeah, I mean, you've got spots in Southeast Asia. You've got areas in Southeast Asia which are obviously not as developed, right? But it's basically the answer is more complex than that. If there is a question, where do you stay? Which part of the world is safer? Which part of the world is more developed? The answer is very complex. I actually spend a bit of my time in Johor Bahru right now. It's a tangent for another conversation, but we have an apartment in Johor, which is a place that's next to Singapore, separated by the causeway and much lower cost of living. And a lot of people look at Johor and think it's a dangerous place. but actually there are parts of Johor which are just beautiful to live in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the answer is not as simple if the question is,
It's
where's the
nuanced
next?
for sure, but
Yeah.
it just feels like every argument that I've heard for how the Western world is more developed, I'm like,
Mhm.
comes from people who've obviously never been to Southeast Asia. And like you said, not everywhere in Southeast Asia is developed or safe or what. So,
Mhm.
but there is just like a trend, and if you really like, if you look at the hotspots for development in North America, New York, LA, San Francisco,
Yeah.
Toronto, I go there and I've lived in North America and Paris, you know what I mean? Like I don't see those places as that developed. They were ahead of their time, but they're falling behind now. And
Hmm.
like crime and all that is on the rise as well. So it's just like it's not it's not such an obvious choice between Western and Eastern hemisphere at this point.
Yeah. And wait, how long have you been in Bangkok?
I moved in August, so very new.
Very recent. Okay. And you're in the Philippines, you're in Manila for a while.
Yeah, I was in the Philippines
How many
for
years was
4 years pretty much. Yeah.
Actually, what brought you there?
In the Philippines?
Yeah.
So the second business I had, which was an ad tech business, we built our developer force in the Philippines. I mean, long story short, we built a team of 30 developers, animators, and designers in Manila. And then when we were there, we obviously networked with a lot of other founders who had ideas. And my partner and I, after 4 or 5 years of that ad tech business, we were kind of a little tired of it. We managed to pretty much automate most of the workflows so we could detach ourselves from the business. And the idea was to look for something else to work on. And this idea for TendoPay came to us because the person like Casper who had the idea initially was our office neighbor. We had Candy Banners, which was the ad tech business, and he was working in a neighboring office space. And he asked us if we could consult on it. Long story short, again, we decided to become co-founders. And in order to achieve that, I moved full-time to Manila. So that's how we ended up in the Philippines overall.
Gotcha. What happened to the tech business?
So we sold it actually during the time when we started TendoPay, and we had fully automated the business, meaning we had managers in place, etc. One of our clients asked us to buy it, Candy Banners, and it was perfect timing for us because we kind of saw ad banners, which ad banners was one of the core products that we were working on. We thought that it was going to go downhill a little bit, and we weren't too sure of where the market was, and we had a very stable income, not growing too much. So when the client said, "Look, I'll buy you out at I think 4 times EBITDA or something," we're like, "Well, we're not growing. It would take 4 years to make that same money. It might decline. We don't know. We can use that money for something else." So we were like, "Okay, you know what? Let's sell it." And then COVID hit, so it got a bit tricky. The deal fell through. But then after the first few months of COVID, we were able to recapture most of our clientele and our revenue shot back up, and the deal came back on the table, and we were able to close it during COVID.
Gotcha. Wow. That was also the
Yeah.
time when you started the Iterative.
Yeah, I guess so. Iterative was early 2021, right? That's basically, or
Early
something like that.
2020.
20?
Yeah.
2020.
Because
Yeah, I guess.
COVID started 19, right?
Yeah, man, I know we celebrated the 4 year anniversary of COVID. Someone with poor taste reminded me that recently. Yeah, so I guess it was that time. Yeah, so basically during the iterative time or right after iterative, something like that, we sold Candy Banners. But again, we weren't really active on it. We were just kind of maintaining and reviewing deals as they came through, but not much more than that.
Gotcha.
So I have a
And
question for
then,
you.
mhm.
Oh, unless you have a question for me. So Bangkok is different. I traveled a lot in Southeast Asia, even before I started TendoPay. Southeast Asia is just a place I really like to be in. And Thailand was always on the list. People talk about Thailand, etc. So I had traveled all over. One of my passions is dirt bike, we call it enduro, but basically dirt biking in the jungle or on in the countryside. And one of my friends who I did enduro with in Canada organized a trip in Thailand where we had a guide, we rented bikes, and we went into northern Thailand. We started in Pai along the border with Laos, and just like 4 days in the jungle, sleeping in huts. And I should probably not say it, but we basically had to, you know, make our own food with chicken that were running around the village. So
Wow.
basically, yeah,
Yeah.
we had to hunt for our own food. The villagers were laughing and helping us do it. But that was my experience, my first experience in Thailand, and I absolutely loved it. I love adventure. I love the idea of having more freedom, people being friendly and not grinding your gears constantly, and just like super chill lifestyle, and super friendly people, just beautiful countryside. So that was my first impression of Thailand. So I started coming back. The next thing I did was I spent a month on Koh Phangan because a friend of mine was living there, and I was like, wow, like what a beautiful island. Again, great food, people are amazing. There's a good mix of expats and and locals. So I fell in love with Thailand, and I just started coming more and more. Like every year I would come to Thailand, and I made a lot of friends here. Some of my friends from the Philippines moved to Bangkok. So when it was time for me to like finish at Tendope, because I
Mhm.
never had the ambition to stay too long after the exit, I it was understood that after my earn out, I would kind of end things there and move
Mhm.
on. One of my friends in Bangkok told me, "Hey, you should come to Bangkok. You're gonna have a great network here. You're gonna meet lots of cool people. Like if you have another idea, you might find a co-founder here." So I was like, okay, I asked my wife. She was super cool with it. She was happy to stay in Southeast Asia because she's Korean, so she's close to family. And we came. We said, let's come for a couple months and see how it is. And yeah, I fell in love with the city because I hadn't spent that much time in Bangkok, to be honest. I thought maybe the islands or whatnot, but Bangkok is just an amazing city overall. I absolutely love being here.
Cool. Thanks for sharing your story.
Yeah, no worries. Something a bit more personal. I'm curious. You're a founder, and for many people that's a scary thought, but there's a lot of positives in being a founder. So between you and me, what do you love about being a founder?
What do I love about being a founder? Hmm. There are many things I love about being a founder. I tend to get a little philosophical, so sometimes my answers are influenced by that. Um, I think
Do
it
it.
boils down to choice. The it boils down to the experience of choosing every single day. Even though if times are hard, even though if things are hard, I get to choose it. Whoever I work with, I actually know I chose to. And when things are going well, I also know that it is a result of my choice. So the experience of being very connected to my choice, my experience of choosing, is probably one of the most profound experiences of being a founder. And that answer can deepen multiple layers because part of being a founder is really growth, right? I think growth accelerates when you're doing what a founder does, or growth can accelerate. Obviously, we could react really badly to the challenges we experience as a founder, and we could end up not growing as a result. But we also have the ability to choose to grow. And I think because of the sheer um, magnitude of the things of what founders experience, we get to choose, we get to grow a lot more, and that's a result of our choice as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. We get to grow, we get a lot of freedom, but that comes at a cost. Obviously, it's super tiring to
Mm,
freedom is tiring because you have to make your own choices. You have to make your own decisions every day.
mm,
So a lot of influencers in this space talk about being able to succeed as a founder is the first thing you need to do is show up every day. Basically, just be present and grow 1% a day. There's all these concepts. So my
yeah.
question to you is, how do you show up every day? How do you have that energy to show up? Because I think that's a tough concept.
Um, First of all, did I? So I don't know if you know, but I started a newsletter on LinkedIn
That was a
about.
little wink to your
Okay,
newsletter. 1% every day, right?
so yeah, so I would answer the question a few ways. One is I think I'm so used to just showing up every day that I don't really think of it as an additional thing to do. And I think maybe a lot of it just boils down to my time in the army, because for 5, 6 years, every single day we wake up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. almost every single day, right? We wake up 5 a.m.
Mhm.
or 6 a.m. even if we don't feel like it. We get into our army fatigues. We go to the parade square. We do our drills. We do our runs. Sometimes, on a weekly basis, we go out into the jungle and we spend 3 or 4 days there. That's showing up even if we don't like it. So it's kind of in a way, it's a bit of a muscle that I've kind of built in the army. But the other way to answer is there's some days where you just don't want to show up, and some days I just want to avoid stuff. And sit down and binge watch some spy movie, um, and I still do. I end up showing up just because there's no one else to show up. Right? If you're a founder, there's no one else is going to show up if you don't show up. And even on days when we feel discouraged, we're there as a discouraged founder, and we're still there. On days when we're all pumped up, great, it's obvious, it's visible, we're definitely showing up. But on days even when we don't show up, actually a version of ourselves shows up, and that version of ourselves has an impact on people. And I think for founders, we have to realize that there is no alternative. The moment you're a founder, whether you show up 100% or you show up 5% or you show up negative 20%, you're actually there. And so for me, thanks for the little wink to my newsletter. At the start of this year, I asked myself, how do I enable myself to show up 100% every day as much as I can? And so I started this, 1%, getting 1% newsletter. I call it a 37x better life. And that's to test the theory that if every day I show up to the act of working on myself and just getting 1% better, whether it's myself, my business, my family, my relationships, could I end up a 37x better person by the end of the year? And that has been super helpful. There are at least 3 or 4 days, 4 or 5 days this year when I felt like, man, I just barely survived the day. I don't want to sit down and show up to my project of working on myself and getting better. But because I made a public commitment, I just did it anyway. And it's been 2 months, 13 days, and every day I've just been showing up for myself. And so that mechanism has been helpful in sort of training myself again, or training myself harder.
So when you say you want to get better by 1%, and this is going to be a shout out to your newsletter, which is cool. When you say you want to improve yourself by 1%, how do you quantify that? Obviously, it's pretty tough, but is it a personal thing? Is it a work thing? Is it a combination? Like, tell me more about your process.
Yeah, so when I started a newsletter on a whim. It was literally on the first day of this year, I decided to start a newsletter. And when I said 1%, I kind of explained it and qualified it in the first newsletter that it's not meant to be quantifiable. It was a concept. It was essentially saying I will do one thing every day that I feel is that I feel would meaningfully move my life trajectory just a little bit, in the right direction, in the direction where I want to hit it. So it's got to be something that, like every day, I've got to do something that's tangible and that has a meaningful impact on my life, right? And for example, on one of the days, I decided there and then that I would start a certificate program by Harvard X on AI, right? And making that decision and completing that first lecture was that 1% forward. On some days, on one of the days, I was especially around on my birthday, I think I wrote a letter to my future self 10 years ago, and penning that letter shaped the way I thought about things, and I believe that act actually helps me improve the way I navigate my life. On some days, I do things like I trained a custom GPT to automate some of these things in my life, and that would have a tangible impact on my productivity. So it's a combination of these different things, but basically every single day, do something that's tangible, that's meaningful, and that moves my life, that creates that bit of increment, like that daily. What's that phrase? Essentially, something that will improve my life meaningfully for that day.
Okay. And so, I agree with you. And I sometimes I have this feeling that I'm doing a bunch of stuff, and I know I am, but having been an entrepreneur for 15 years, I always feel like I'm not doing enough. It's like a fact. And some days I feel like, okay, I've done all this stuff, but I could have done so much more. I know deep inside I have this imposter syndrome almost. I'm like, ugh, like I'm such a loser. I'm such a lazy guy, blah, blah, blah. There's all these people building 10 times faster than me. Like, how do you handle that? I'm sure it happens to you every now and then as well.
Um, yeah, and I know, I've heard enough, spoken enough to people to know that it happens to all of us. I haven't met anybody who has ever said I don't experience any of that. For me, one of the things that I've been doing for the last 10 years at least is an exercise called morning pages. Have you heard of it?
No.
So um, it's an act of it's a mindful practice, and it's taken from a book called The Artist's Way by Julie Cameron. And the idea is this: every morning, the moment you wake up, you take 3 sheets of A4 paper or letter size paper, and you just write in long form everything that comes to your mind. And the way the author expresses it is you do it first thing in the morning before your ego wakes up. Anything that just comes to your mind. And I found it to be an incredibly grounding practice because just doing that allows me to just surface a lot of thoughts that's in my mind, impacting me in very subtle ways. Sometimes is stuff that I'm really excited about and I need an outlet. Sometimes, actually, a lot of times, is stuff that I feel experience stress about, and it's been an incredible practice. I've been doing this pretty much almost every single day for more than 10 years now. And it's the one thing that grounds me. And in recent years, I've been reading a lot more about spirituality and really who we are, like the different dimensions to us. And that's been helping me deal with all the little chatter in my head.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, that sounds amazing. I did the 5 minute journal thing like that for a while. I don't know. There's something like I need to be more consistent on those types of practices to see results. I guess I get too impatient and I'm like, well,
Mhm.
nothing happened this week. What's
Mm.
up with that?
Mm.
So
I think
that's
I
my
think the
problem. It's
one the
impatience.
one thing that I say the one thing that I think it does very well is it really enables us to go deep. And I think that's the
Hmm.
most important thing. I think it's very easy for a lot of us these days. We're just surrounded by activity. We're surrounded by the competition. We're surrounded by things to do. We invent things to do. It's very easy to be very busy at the surface level. The real challenge is going deep. And I've come to realize that when I go deep, I find a sense of contentment. I find a sense of calmness and peace that I cannot get to by simply trying a whole bunch of surface level tactics. And the morning pages exercise really forces me to go deep because the author basically says, do not stop until you finish 3 whole pages of continuous writing. And when I first experienced it, it was really hard, right? After writing a few lines, I was like, what am I doing? A whole bunch of reasons would pop up for me to stop before the 3 pages end. And then even today, sometimes it happens as well. But I found that by just forcing yourself to go through everything, just pouring yourself out first thing in the day, it's a great practice.
And it's not just business stuff. Like it can be personal. It can be anything.
It's everything.
Wow. Okay. Any other life hacks that you've applied in your life? I know that, for example, last year I stopped drinking for 8 months, saw the huge productivity boost. Then I fell off the wagon for a bit, and again this year I started it. It's to me, one of the biggest life hacks. I wish I had a time machine to tell my younger self, do not drink. It brings absolutely zero value to your life. I have just as much fun when I go out without drinking now. So I'm
Mhm.
curious if you have any life hacks you've accessed or tapped into.
I think I've got a bunch. One of the things I enjoy talking about is a meetup that I started in 2016. It's called Type A Breakfast. And the idea is at 7:30 a.m. on a Monday morning, people would just show up at a cafe and we would work for 2 hours together without talking to each other. We just come together and work for 2 hours. And the goal is to complete a whole day's worth of work within those 2 hours. So I would get participants to prepare this way. I'd say Sunday night, think of all the things you want to accomplish in 1 week. That's 5 days worth of work. And then if you believe in the Pareto principle, that it is 20% of your work that gives you 80% of your result, I say to them, well, take 20% of the most important work that you've allocated for the week or that you plan for the week and aim to finish them by Monday. Now take that 8 hours worth of work, come to Type A breakfast at 7:30 a.m. in the morning and make use of Parkinson's law and peer pressure. Parkinson's law basically says that work expands to fill the amount of time that you allocate to it. And peer pressure is peer pressure. And so we have people at the cafe and I say at 7:30, your day starts now. You've got 2 hours to finish 8 hours worth of work. Every half an hour, I say 2 hours is gone. A quarter of your day is gone. Half your day is gone. 3/4 of your day is gone. And you've got 5 more minutes before your entire day is gone. And in all these Type A breakfast sessions, by 9:30 or 9:40, we have a whole bunch of participants that basically say, I think I've finished pretty much everything that I want to do for the day. And that's been one of the most enjoyable times. I actually found myself working so productively. I found myself being so much more productive when I was organizing those Type A breakfasts. And it has spilled over. A bunch of people have done it. They've experienced it as well. I was in Melbourne when I started this meetup, and then one of my friends in Singapore said, let me do this in Singapore, and he started this meetup in Singapore. We eventually had people just pick up on this concept. It's been, a couple of reporters have gone down for a session and have written about it. I think there's one reporter from Rice Media who wrote about it. Another blogger wrote about it. We've had people just randomly say in Bangkok, in Tokyo, in where was the place? Estonia, just say, hey, I want to organize a Type A breakfast. And they've done it. It kind of stopped during COVID because obviously we could no longer gather in person. But some people are still doing Type A breakfast in Singapore, and it's one of the most fun things I've done to increase my own productivity.
I love that. Maybe I'll start a chapter in Bangkok if you'll let me.
Oh, it's open source. The reason why we start at 7:30 is because I thought I want to get Type A people together. And who are the Type A people? The people who want to finish the entire day's work by 9:30 a.m. on a Monday when everybody else is just getting to work.
Start. Yeah, I love that. No, I think it's super. 100% going to try it for myself, but you're right. The peer pressure is important. So I need to at least find someone to do it with, someone crazy enough to want to do that at first and take the plunge. One last thing before we finish, before I ask you like the final questions. If you weren't working on what you're doing right now, and you seem to have a ton of ideas, so it's going to be an easy one for you, what would you be working on if you weren't working on what you're doing now?
Too many things. I think the easiest answer would probably be somewhere, either a venture studio or venture studio / accelerator, or maybe building something big for a large company.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
I like the idea of venture studio, and recently I've been talking to people in private equity and seeing if there are deals to be made as well, because Southeast Asia is ripe for small ticket size private equity. So I'm also looking into the fund side. Okay, so now before I let you go, there's one thing I want to know is, it's kind of like a random question you want to ask to the next guest without knowing who they are. And I'll make sure to ask that question.
Oh, so you're going to ask me what your previous guest...
I will ask you as well, but first you're going to ask them so you don't get inspiration from them.
Gotcha. Any question I want to ask the next guest? Maybe this is a bit of a cliche, right? But how will you measure your life?
Okay. It's your question. So now the question I got from the previous founder or the previous guest was, how do you see the Philippines growing or going towards in the next 5 years?
I did not expect that question. And I have no answer. I don't pay close enough attention to the Philippines as much as I would love to. I've just been so focused on, where I am and my core business, which is really Singapore and the US. I would say though that I have a close affinity for the Philippines. I actually spent cumulatively maybe definitely more than half a year in the Philippines in the past. I would go down and I would help at some of the feeding stations and the orphanages. So I feel for the people of the Philippines, and the I hope that more can be done to alleviate poverty in the country.
Okay, that's a very thoughtful answer. Thank you. And so, before I let you go, is there anything you want to shout out to at any level? Your business, your newsletter, anything you want to shout out?
Uh, well, not so much. Just really appreciate us catching up in this conversation.
Same here.
I have been thinking about starting a podcast as well. I am not. I didn't want to do it because I don't want to do it because um, I'm not really motivated by how many people I can get listen to me speak, but I actually enjoy having conversations with people. And sometimes I wish, I constantly ask myself, how do I scale everything I do? And sometimes I wonder if it might be fun to do exactly what you're doing. And so one of the things, one of the little motivations or benefits for being on this podcast is I get to experience how you do it, and I get to see if I can actually implement it as well.
I mean,
So thank you
be
for
my
doing what
guest.
you did.
For me, it's a big creative outlet because I'm like you. I like to automate everything, try to systemize everything, and this is the one thing that you have to show up. You have to be creative. You have to, keep someone going and ask them questions for an hour. And at the end of the day, if I get 10 views and one person tells me they got inspired, that's good enough for me. I'm not trying to reach a huge audience. I'm really trying to inspire a few people to
Mm-hmm.
build something, or at least
Mm.
to feel like they're not alone in their struggle of building, that there are other founders out there who have been through the same experiences. And if they can learn anything from us, then I'm happy to share that.
Mm-hmm. And you've done it in a very so I learned a bit. Actually, I learned quite a fair bit from you and from your process. So I really appreciate it. So thank you. I've seen how you've automated the steps. You've created a process that's so easy to just come on board. There wasn't a need for us to like have sessions before to prepare for this session. You made it really easy, and you showed how easy it can be. So I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But that's the podcast. Thank you so much, Melvin, for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure as well. Thank you.